Jem, can I call you Jem?
Of course.
Okay. So, okay, I might as well just say it because of the recording. So you're Professor of Cultural Studies, is that right, at East London University, amongst
Yeah.
other?
Technically Professor of Cultural and Political Theory, but
Right.
doesn't really mean anything.
Well, it means that okay, it can be said you're pretty much an expert on culture, at least in the way it's been understood, because obviously everyone talks about culture wars, and my talk's going to be called the Psychedelic Culture Wars, and
Sure.
I'm aware of it being very much a thing of the right instigating culture wars, but my thing has continually been that's going to be annoying, those notifications, but never mind. So
Maybe
yeah,
try and turn everything off.
yeah, no, that's my own notifications, but where would I turn all those off notifications now? So this is all going to record, so
Well, it doesn't matter.
no, it doesn't
But I
matter.
don't.
So look, so yeah, so my thing is understanding that there is obviously a culture war, because it's even any kind of uprising and say political uprising, progressive is engaged in some kind of culture, battle of cultures. The right seems to be instigating it more with the whole woke culture. And what struck me about hegemony now, I'm going to say hegemony because I know it's hegemonia in Italian, but people say it in different ways. But hegemony now is the subtitle, how big tech and Wall Street won the world. And my contention has been for the last 10 years or so is that psychedelics is kind of another technology that is slowly being appropriated in that way, and it's done, I don't even necessarily think it's necessarily with intent in some cases. I mean, there's some very objective seeming scientists who are probably innocently just going along with the flow. That's me being very generous. And there are others who just accept that this is the way of the world, what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism. So yeah, I kind of wanted just a little bit of grounding on that. So you talked a lot about Silicon Valley and the growth of tech there, and I'd say that that's probably around the space where psychedelics started to find favor in the 60s.
Yeah.
Started to be reinterpreted. What do you know of MAPS, the multidisciplinary circuit?
Yeah, I know a lot about MAPS. Yeah.
Yeah. The leading figures. I mean, Rick Doblin, he was actually on Joe Rogan the other week.
Yeah, I know.
I don't know if you caught that.
I didn't hear it. I haven't listened to it.
I mean, there's a point where Joe Rogan, and this is Joe Rogan, stops him short where he starts to understand almost naively that he's getting involved with big business and for-profit companies. And he says, that's bad news. That is, you can't be mixing these sacred plants, whatever, with commercialization. That's going to go a bad way. And he had to check himself. He took a break and came back. So for Joe Rogan, he gets all the criticism to say that.
Yeah.
It shows that there are a lot of people worried. My thing is that I just don't see where there's a kind of official left resistance, certainly not in Britain. I mean, in America, there's symposia. But what are your thoughts on it? I mean, how do you see it going in the way it's developing?
Well, I think it's a very complicated situation. And I think your analysis is spot on. In fact, I'm supposed to be working on an academic journal article sometime in the next couple of years, which might be a chapter of a future book about just this topic, which is basically arguing that for the most part, not exclusively, but for the most part, the so-called psychedelic renaissance is pretty much a political cultural effect of Silicon Valley, in effect becoming the leading section of global capitalism. And the fact that for various historical reasons, like some of them sort of ideological, some of them pretty contingent historically, people in, stuff that people in Silicon Valley have always liked has become a lot more mainstream, a lot more socially and culturally acceptable in many circles as their global power and status has risen. Whether you're talking about Dungeons and Dragons or whether you're talking about LSD, frankly. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. to the extent that those are kind of all sort of interesting technologies of consciousness expansion of various kinds that might be useful to people. And I think when we're thinking about the power of Silicon Valley in the contemporary sort of global capitalist sphere, then it's quite, as we say in the book, actually, it's quite complicated, because on the one hand, it's clear that Silicon Valley is the leading edge of capitalism. It's the most dynamic, the leading sector of the capitalist class as such. And from a certain radical perspective, that means they are the leading force of our enemies. On the other hand, it's also arguably the case that at least significant sections of Silicon Valley would amount to what Antonio Gramsci called the progressive sections of capital, where he was writing about Henry Ford and his Detroit car factories in the 30s, and the way in which, well, on the one hand, there were bad things about what he was doing, but there were also, potentially progressive things about the way he was just massively improving the people's potential productivity and raising standards of living, even while he was sort of intensifying exploitation. So from that point of view, I think, the right now, the most dangerous section of the capitalist class in the world is not Silicon Valley. It's still fossil fuels. It's the carbon sector, and it's the particular groupings which you would associate with partly with fossil fuel extraction and partly with landlordism, really. And those are the people who are backing the sort of far right. They're the people who are backing people like Trump, and they are more dangerous. And probably we're not going to have like a worldwide workers' revolution against capitalism before we have to do something dramatic about climate change and carbon extraction. And probably that will mean that what I would call progressive forces, meaning sort of organized labor, sort of democratic political movements, etc., probably will have to make various kinds of alliance with sections of Silicon Valley. Not all of them, but some of them. And I think the psychedelic renaissance, the so-called psychedelic renaissance, is an interesting example of that. That I would say some elements of that, of the psychedelic renaissance, have been clearly progressive in nature. Some have been pretty much politically neutral, to the extent that they've happened to the extent that a certain kind of mainstream liberalism, especially in America, has realized that psychedelics don't necessarily pose any threat to its norms and values. So you might as well let people have fun with them. And some of them have been politically fairly conservative. Hang on, sorry, I've got to get there's someone at the door. I've got to make sure it's not a family member trying to get in.
Pause.
I'm saying, so
yeah.
So I think, and some elements of that process have clearly are really problematic. The attempt to, and you look at the kind of things Symposia has protested against, and the things that MAPS has got itself involved with, they involve corporations trying to set themselves up effectively as monopolies, which is absolutely typical of the current phase of platform capitalism, as Nick Sonichek calls it. Set themselves as monopolies, extending their IP rights over various types of therapeutic and pharmaceutical knowledge in ways which is really, really problematic, like extremely problematic. And so, well, what a political response to that would look like, I think, is a really good question. And what a political response would look like, other than a sort of purist anarchist sort of rejection of any sort of engagement whatsoever with the corporate sector, is a really good question. I don't think there's an immediate and obvious answer to it, but I think it is a really good question, and I think it is a question that needs to be thought about. I think we need to think about, what if you're approaching these questions with a somewhat strategic but nonetheless sort of critical and radical political perspective. I would say probably what it means is you've got to find ways of trying to differentiate between, between sort of forms of corporate or official or state-sanctioned engagement in the psychedelic space, which might have some genuinely positive potential for people, and those which are clearly not very unlikely to. But
Yeah.
what the criteria are going to be for making that judgment is going to be a political question, which you need some sort of an organized movement to be able to judge. It's not really something that someone like me can just pontificate about.
Yeah.
I think we would need some sort of an organized movement. And I think, well, the biggest weakness in this space at the moment is the fact that, well, there really isn't, you're right, there isn't really a sort of organized movement asking the question, well, actually, really, what would it mean to approach this, to approach the question of psychedelics and their use and their legal status and their pharmaceutical, their medicinal status? What would it mean to approach that from a perspective which is critical, but is also strategic?
I think critical, strategic, yes, but I think, see, my why I'm so focused on the idea of cultural attitude as much as anything, and for me, why I liked Alan Piper mentioning, the romantics and the modernists of the 19th century challenging mechanization and kind of formalization. So they were doing anything transgressive, dangerous, intoxication. And there was an element of that even happened in the 60s, free love and this kind of complete expression, which obviously it was going to run aground to conventions, moral and social conventions, some of those deliberately stifling. For example, we've got this Puritan culture that has always been, up against this challenge. And my concern, this is a personal thing, because I followed Symposia for quite a long time, and a lot of their political analysis I'm absolutely spot on, and even their exposure of abuse within certain therapeutic sessions. The problem for me is that the worry is that the left can do this, is, again, talking of culture, and this almost sounds like a right-wing trope, but this idea of shaming, of cultural shaming, if someone steps outside of the, and it's almost doing the right's job for them in saying that everything must be so precise and so safe first. And it's, they're trying to undermine corporatization, which I understand, but they could end up doing kind of justifying it even more, because further down the line, it's okay, well, we'll keep them even more restricted and we'll create even more of a two-tier system.
Well, also, I mean, I do support them. I've always tried to give them as much support as I can, Symposia, but indeed, I mean, their politics is, as far as I can make it out, is a sort of, austere anarchism.
Yeah.
And that kind of austere anarchism, especially in North America, it does very quickly just descend. It becomes a kind of identity politics. Actually, it becomes just another kind of identity politics, where your identity as an anarchist, as an anti-capitalist, is the thing you're constantly defending from incursions. And I mean, we would have to get very philosophical to elaborate this here, but the problem is you end up actually just effectively producing a kind of heightened form of the kind of liberalism which are sort of normative within North American and British political culture, and which are really part of the problem. I mean, it's not really a collectivist politics.
No.
If it's a politics which is based on, policing individual behavior all the time and kind of judging political behavior all the time.
Yeah. Or even group behavior. As I say, I would criticize Rick Doblin and others there for having kind of just acceded as much as possible to capital and saying, look, this is the way it's going to be done. We were open source, but then other companies such as Compass start to go private. So we have to do the same thing. We have to keep our options. So I can understand that. The attack line for Rick Doblin at the moment is, for example, he said things when he was younger that he was a therapist in his own way, kind of like a folk therapist, administering MDMA and kind of working through people's issues at festivals. And this is suddenly, some members of Symposia online and on Twitter have been kind of castigating that. And what I've said, and I've said it online to them because I wanted to engage, but they've not really wanted to engage in it so far, is that could end up continually delegitimizing just counterculture itself, which the whole point of it was it resisted all of those cultural norms. And I think we're back in that kind of space again, where it's not as clearly defined as left and right, more of people who are absolutely going to follow the rules. And the danger, of course, of people who then break the rules and become outlaws is that they can go in any direction. But if a left doesn't have that organic sense of the wildness almost, then it becomes as rigid as the very thing it's attempting to fight. That's my contention.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I'd say a few things in relation to that. I mean,
Mm.
one is that, I mean, sort of structurally and in terms of mood and vibe, I mean, those guys, they seem to come out of this North American tradition, which is politically, historically, you would associate with projects like Earth First, for example.
Right.
Um, which is very much about this kind of adoption of a full-time activist identity, and is completely, it just isn't interested in the question of what like a sort of popular politics around any of these issues might look
Mm.
like.
Mm.
And I think there's I'd cite as a possible alternative to that the ideas of somebody like Kate Soper, the
Okay.
British
Yes.
philosopher whose work in recent years is arguing from an ecological perspective, is arguing for what she calls alternative hedonisms,
Mm.
arguing for the idea that, well, the way in which you want to popularize an ecological perspective is not by telling people all the stuff they can't have
Mm.
now if they're going to save the planet, but by enabling people to understand the extent to which, well, actually, it would just, an ecological way of life can be just aesthetically preferable, can be
Mm.
more luxurious in certain
Mhm.
ways, and to one which is based on kind of, mass production of disposability.
Yeah.
So, and I would say something that's probably similar actually around psychedelics that I think, yeah, I think you're right. I think there's something, something about the fact that psychedelics are sort of pointless if they're not fun, actually.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
it's not a fun thing to do, and it's then there isn't a lot of point to it.
Yeah.
I think is probably worth hanging on to, and I think. I mean, I think how that's, and I think how that's, but I think how that's relevant. I think it's worth thinking about, in bigger terms, like how all that might be relevant to thinking about those issues. I think maybe I think I think I want to sort of, I'll pull back for a moment and think about,
Yeah.
for example, the case of maps and like what's the sort of problem with maps. I mean, the thing with maps is maps starts from the perspective, and has always started from the perspective, and this is normal, completely normal within the sort of psychedelic space institutionally and culturally, that in some sense psychedelics are like a good thing in themselves.
Mm.
They are a good thing. Access to them is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, getting people access to them by any means necessary is justifiable. Like, it doesn't matter really ultimately how you get people access to them. That if the way you can legitimate them and legalize them is by convincing venture capitalists with the money to lobby politicians that they can make billions in profit from them, then that's okay, because that is the means to an end.
Mm.
And that is an attitude to what is, as you said earlier, that is an attitude to what is basically a technology,
Yeah.
which is absolutely typical of Silicon Valley. It is part of the historic ideology of Silicon Valley is to believe that there are technological solutions to social problems,
Mm-hmm.
and that technology in itself can solve social or psychological problems.
Mm.
And I would say, from a critical perspective, that's utter nonsense. Like, just any child can have explained to them very easily that, computers in themselves are not good or bad. It's a question of what you do with them and the
Mm.
context in which they are deployed.
Mm-hmm.
And the same is true for all kinds of things. The same is true for psychedelics, I think.
Mm.
And I think that the idea, and I think, on the one hand, just from a sort of liberal or libertarian perspective, there's a small cultural social gain in dismantling drug prohibition laws, which are just prima facie ridiculous. I mean,
Yeah.
that's something that just has to be acknowledged.
And
The
highly.
drug prohibition is a completely failed project that was formulated on the basis of racist mythologies in the early 20th century. It serves no useful purpose other than to enrich people who don't do any social good for anyone.
Mm.
It just doesn't, and to provide a legitimation for kind of mass incarceration of certain populations. So there's just a basic prima facie case for dismantling drug prohibition. And to that extent, that it's reasonable to say, it's a good idea to achieve that dismantling, pretty much by any political means you can.
Mm.
I think there's another question for me, though, which is a more of a sort of philosophical question, a speculative question, which is about, well, the fact that the most influential discourse within which psychedelics are becoming sort of partially mainstreamed, partially sort of culturally legitimated over the past 10, 20 years is essentially a therapeutic, a medical discourse. It's a discourse which says psychedelics ought to be available to people, not just because they're fun and they want to do them, but because they have some positive value, some ethical value in terms of their medical and psychological potential. The trouble with this is, look, from a sort of critical historical perspective, I would say, now this is something that will upset lots of people. People hear me saying it, but there's a pretty good evidence, I would say, of there being a long history of new innovative forms of psychotherapy seeming to have very powerful effects, very powerful results when they're relatively new. And the apparent efficacy of those therapies rapidly declining once they become medically institutionalized. And I would say, from a certain sort of radical conceptual perspective, I would say that's because what happens is, when they are new, those therapeutic practices, whether you're talking about psychoanalysis in its early wild days, whether you're talking about sort of just mindfulness in its kind of early days, whether you're talking about psychedelics, whatever you're talking about, there's a moment when those things are relatively new, when what they're doing for people is they're giving them a way of breaking out of an established set of ways of being in the world, which are imposed upon them by the logic of capitalism and capitalism's tendency to privatize personal experience, to cut people off from each other, to impose a whole model of what it means to be human, which is fundamentally flawed and alienating and individualistic in damaging ways. And I think this is even true. I mean, this is true even of something like Prozac. When Prozac first comes on the market, well, it's a new thing for people. All these sort of middle-class people, are being given this kind of serotonin booster, and they're sort of feeling good, and they're able to express their feelings more, and they're kind of feeling happy. And at that precise moment, this is the moment of the late 80s. It's the moment of Reaganism and Thatcherism. It's the moment when almost any sort of thing that makes you feel like you can relax a bit, you can, step back from the rat race, you can talk to your friends, like you don't have to be sort of pushing yourself to succeed or doing coke to help you. It's sort of liberating for people, momentarily, so temporarily. So there's all these fantastic results showing that Prozac is like this miracle antidepressant. It's going to cure the problem of depression for people. Within 10, 15 years, Prozac is yesterday's news. It just doesn't seem to work anymore to a large extent for people, because the culture, capitalism itself sort of adapts, it changes, it shifts. By the end of the 90s, we're in a different cultural moment where, being more expressive, a bit more tactile, a bit more emotional is part of the norms, which that capitalist culture is reproducing, and it's not. And so just taking Prozac doesn't feel liberatory anymore. I mean, the same thing happened for sort of our age cohort in Britain with MDMA, to be honest. Like at the start of the 90s, especially for young men, like just going out and having a nice time and not getting into fights with people.
Absolutely.
It was like this revolutionary thing. By the end of the 90s, a new form of sort of club culture had been fully codified and commercialized, and basically, the big commercial clubs had turned into, essentially sort of sexual meat markets, which were just had a different vibe to the meat markets of 10 years previously. But capitalism had successfully adapted in ways which could contain all of that.
Well, sorry, I was going to say they had to bring in the criminal justice bill first.
Yeah, they did, of course. All this stuff had to happen, but it did happen.
It did, yeah.
And my very strong, my fear is that a lot of the apparent therapeutic value that people now attribute to psychedelics is going to be lost as psychedelic practice becomes fully incorporated into a certain kind of, sort of corporate retreat culture, basically. It's going to be lost. People are not going to be getting the revelatory insights from doing mushrooms in a field that people like us might have had at certain times in our lives, when this is something which is being fully controlled, commodified, and contained, it's not going to mean the same thing to people. When you get back to your corporate job on a Monday morning and your boss says, "Oh, great, how was your psilocybin retreat? Mine was really nice." It'll still be a pleasant thing for people to do. But what it won't be doing is opening that little crack in capitalist realism, that things which are somewhat outside of that cultural mainstream, by force of being outside that cultural mainstream, can do. Now, I'm not saying, I'm not totally pessimistic. It's not to say that's an unavoidable fate for things like psychedelic therapy. But I think it's an unavoidable fate for, say, forms of psychedelic therapy that aren't self-consciously linked to a broader project of political emancipation.
Absolutely.
And I think that's the question, really. The question for me is always, well, what would it mean to link those things to a broader question, a broader project of political emancipation, a broader sort of, really a socialist politics? I mean, for me, the question is always, well, what, I always make all this commentary, as you know, from the perspective that, I don't really care about psychedelics. I'm a socialist. What I care about is advancing socialism. So and what I care about, the question for me is well, is it possible to constitute, a form of psychedelic culture within which is in some sense allied to the aspiration for radical democratic social change, which is rather than just allied to the project of adapting people to post neoliberal, Silicon Valley led hypercapitalism? I think that is a really good question, and I think you're right. I think that's the question you're sort of gesturing us towards. And I don't really think, I mean, I would have to say, I think there are people in the state, and in Britain, I don't think anyone's addressing that question at all. I don't think, it's not a key question. I think in the States, you would have to say, just as, for example, within say, Buddhism in the States, there's been really significant pushback against corporate mindfulness. There's been really significant attempts by Buddhist practitioners to think very critically about how to make sure that meditative and contemplative practice isn't just a way of coping with alienation and exploitation, that it doesn't just sort of numb people, that it does facilitate relations of solidarity. There's a lot of that going on from sort of activist practitioners in the States, people who've been influenced by Black Lives Matter, people who've been influenced by feminism, people who are influenced by, the rising interest in democratic socialism. And if anything, I think that, and also, I know on a more local level, on a lower scale, there have been similar things going on with psychedelics. There's been people who've tried to link, for example, not just decriminalization, but access to, mushrooms and the people in places in parts of the Pacific Northwest on very local levels, I know, have been engaged in political projects which have been specifically about not just decriminalizing mushrooms locally, but also essentially making sure that people can grow their own mushrooms and they're not going to have to buy them from Compass. They want to making sure that people have access to knowledge about how they can be used safely and interestingly, without having to, go on corporate retreats, etc. And so I think that kind of work is really positive. I think that kind of work is really, I think that probably is a really interesting model. I think there's very little of that going on in Britain. I don't think there's anything of that going on in Britain, really.
Yeah, I think maybe this is perhaps I'm going to say here, and I kind of want to touch on to kind of what acid communism and Mark Fisher's idea was about. I just want to but maybe in Britain, philosophically, it's not as a religious country, it's not as comfortable with talking about religion and spirituality. And I don't know how the left perceives that in America. We mentioned symposium, a bit of that kind of austere view. But my experience often, having been someone who, when I was studying, university Marxism, I still had that kind of spirit. I was also at the very same time taking ecstasy and having these what I considered spiritual experiences, like interest in Buddhism, etc., and continually had the experience of being belittled for my superstitious idiocy, because a good, honest Marxist would always be a historical materialist, and religion is the opium of the masses, etc. And I feel that where the left could grow, and where even science could grow, is in embracing this unknown aspect of spirituality, rather than trying to, let's find the most scientifically reductionist form of it so that it can fit into our system. Rather, how can we make our system adapt to what seems to be a very human element of, even with psychedelics, having this experience of the sacred, such that the scientists are saying, you know, they have to put in their gold standard peer-reviewed studies mystical type experience. And
Yes, I think you're right. Yes, I think that's a really good point. I mean, this is, you know, I would refer to the work of you know, our friend Eric Davis.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who he was very keen to stress the extent to which, yeah, the religious, not just the spiritual, is a sort of irreducible factor of human experience.
Yeah.
And also with reference to psychedelics, the point Eric always makes is that in some sense, the sheer weirdness of psychedelics is something we still don't really know what to do with. I think that's also true, actually. I mean, I don't really know what to do with it. I mean, like, you know, my trajectory, like loads of people's, was to experiment a lot with psychedelics when I was younger, and then sort of just get into yoga and meditation, which is much more controlled, and it doesn't and in a good way, I mean, in a good way, you know, it's not weird. You know, you do your yoga, it has a predictable effect. You do more of it has the same effect, and it's the effect that it says in the books and in the books from 500 years ago that it's going to have. And you sort of understand why. There's a theory of why, which, you know, coming from the, you know, the Indian sources, and then there are modern kind of, you know, medical models as to why it has those effects. But
absolutely,
those effects with psychedelics, it's true, and even philosophically, actually, I think we still don't really know what to do with them, because you're right. I mean, part of the problem with the kind of therapeutic claims being made for them is that really the therapeutic claims being made for psychedelics are just claims that should be made for any sort of mystical experience. And I sometimes do say this to people when I'm asked, sort of, you know, I mean, I get sort of young sort of activists all the time. You know, there are lots of young activists who also like tripping, and they want me to somehow give them a formula according to which they can tell themselves tripping is inherently radical, that you should definitely do it. And I always say, look, honestly, no. I mean, it was really good for me, but, you know, half the people I knew who did psychedelics when I was younger didn't really get anything good out of it. And
or they went mad, or they went to prison, but I think that there's something, again, to mention Alan Piper, the transgressive element is part of it. You can't legitimize it, but in a way, you know, yoga, meditation, and even a lot of the kind of tech bro culture of perfectionism, individual perfectionism, it fits in very neatly with a society of productivity, of, you know, kind of increasing productivity. Whereas disruptors like psychedelics, when left to their own devices, they create amazing, you know.
Well, I think that's true. I was just finished the point I was making it, which is it's boring, but it's really simple. Is that from a really basic rationalist perspective, the only thing we can really know about psychedelics, we don't really know how they work. I mean, the brain chemistry stuff, the neuroscience is more developed than it was, but they don't really know how they work. All we know is that there's these physical substances which can reliably reproduce states of mind which seem to be, they more closely resemble classically described mystical experiences than anything else, although they're not identical, they're not exactly the same. And the question of, well, what do you even do with that philosophically? What do you do with that knowledge? Is still sort of mysterious. It is still an open question. Well, what do we do with it? I mean, because for me, philosophically, the most obvious step from that, and this is one that's, I don't know why this always surprises to people, is that it does confirm a sort of fundamentally materialist worldview. The fact that these, you know, transformatory and enormous psychic experiences can be reliably induced by a chemical, you know, rather than, you know, just by prayer or by, you know, the intercession of the saints or whatever, you know, does confirm for me a basically materialist worldview. But it also has to be a materialist worldview within which the reality of religious and mystical experience as part of human experience also has to be acknowledged, that you can't dismiss those things as cultural artifacts or as pathologies. And so that is where you end up, I think. And I think that's exactly what you were getting at, isn't it? That is where you have to end up with psychedelics as a historical materialist. You have to end up in a place where you say, well, yeah, actually, all this stuff, the religious, the spiritual, this stuff that we just thought we could dismiss in the 19th century, it turns out it is real. You know, we've got, so it definitely is real. but it's also the case that we were probably right to say, well, it's not supernatural in nature. It's somehow it is a natural dimension of experience. And then I think you're right. Where you go from that is it, I don't know. It's a good question. I think you're probably right, actually. Probably American culture is so much richer in terms of its forms of religiosity that there are more resources for people to draw on, actually, to put those things together. I think that's probably true.
And would you not say that, I suppose that, because again, I mean, the last couple of years, I didn't quite finish it, but I was at Bath Spa studying environmental humanities. One of the books I read was Sylvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch.
Yeah.
The Enclosures Act, and just how witchcraft was actually used more you know, the intention, or at least the profession, that it was about witches and you know, demonic possession. It was actually about moving women and all feminine qualities of nurturance and community out of public, what were public spaces, and enclosing them into private hands. And there's something philosophical that happens in Britain with the Enlightenment and how it coincides with capitalism, which is anything that smacks of a kind of supernatural element. I mean, I wouldn't go so far. I mean, it's very difficult to talk about what supernatural means. I know that certainly from festival culture and, you know, Eastern mysticism, etc., and even Western mysticism, the idea of an intelligence, a source, the consciousness, the ground of all being, guiding you, and that you get out of the way. And there's all these techniques that can be used, but they are by their definition, even in the literature, the philosophical literature, disruptive. They can send you mad, but if you totally believe in it and let go, even in community, it has its own power. And that, in a way, if we try to reduce it to who's on the left, who's on the right, in a way, we're living in a post-rave culture where so many people have been comfortable taking these different substances, and that there's something in me of opening up for the left and for even science, because I'm not anti-science in this. I'm just saying that we should be starting to open to the possibility that this could have its own energy, and that it could have its own revolutionary potential in a way that we might not even be able to define at the moment. And I just feel that there's an instinctive resistance to that, because it sounds like, oh my God, you're going to be astrology. If you mention astrology, then you're definitely, you know, you're an outcast immediately. You can't be a true revolutionary if you're into astrology or crystals, for example. And it's that kind of division within even the populace that makes any kind of collective action seem more difficult than it should be, really.
Well, I think all that's true, but I think we have to keep in mind, you know, that there are good reasons for people being skeptical about those things, and that, you know, the one of the great risks for any sort of political radicalism is also sort of millenarianism, meaning that you sort of convince yourself that you convince yourself by sort of you convince yourself firstly that victory is just around the corner, however much it looks like you're being defeated, and you convince yourself that victory is imminent, sort of irrespective of what you do or whether you behave strategically or not. And the idea of sort of giving yourself up to the movement and giving yourself up to the moment is often associated with those kinds of millenarianism. So I think it has to be handled. I think that it does have to be handled really carefully. I think that kind of approach, and I think one can see why. Yeah, one can see why people would be skeptical about it. Well, I think one has to be honest about the sort of justifiability of people's skepticism towards anything that looks like the politicization of mysticism, or the kind of mystification of politics.
The mystification of politics. I mean, you know, we're, as you mentioned at the start, we're at the threshold of, you know, properly cataclysmic climate change and environmental breakdown, you know, mass migration, you know, everything, you know, without wanting to be too overly dramatic. In fact,
sure,
most of us are being not dramatic. So really the chances of us surviving it intact are pretty thin anyway. It's almost as if to say, it's not to say, you know, I'm certainly not saying, oh, you know, you let go and everything will work out. But there is an element of, there is a kind of energetic potential once it's again, this is something that you would have to explain to me a little bit more, but it's that kind of idea of, and it seems that everything from post 2016, as you mentioned, the book has broken down in such a way. Neoliberalism in its old form is over, and something new is coming in, which is very disruptive. And there was always that, I think, is it Nick Land, the right-wing accelerationism, and that there was briefly this idea of left accelerationism, of somehow just allowing, rather than trying to predict and control the movement, that you almost allow it to, almost anarchistically allow it to take on its own head of steam. And it might be just as disruptive or destructive, but there is a potential that something at least comes out of that which is not so easy to control and appropriate from the powers already existing. Because that's what it seems to me, that the left movements, whether they're Extinction Rebellion and any of the other movements, they get infiltrated so quickly. And I'm pretty sure that that's what's happening with psychedelics as well, politically. That, you know, when Robert Mercer puts $1 million in, you know, he's placing his chip there, and you know, those figures are making sure that they've got that angle covered. And I just feel that there's an inherent mysticism there. Again, not to get superstitious about it or say it is a specific thing, but there's some kind of, for me, disruptive revolutionary potential, which is this wildness, which a lot of festival culture I know has gone into, especially in post-pandemic, into a kind of real conspiratory, you know, I even have an issue with conspirituality as a way of defining the whole of anything mystical, that it's automatically can be dismissed as, you take the worst examples, you get, you know.
Yeah, sure.
You know, that guy in January the 6th with the bear skin and the horns almost became a totem for that. Look what can happen to you if you take too many psychedelics. Don't you stray from the science, because you'll go mad too, rather than have this almost slightly more, at least more open-minded view of what that might lead to. It could actually lead to some positive outcomes as well, rather than saying it will. And I just wonder where there could be that kind of openness. I think that you mentioned Eric Davis for one, but the newer versions of that, I felt that there was a whole branch of ecofeminism which I felt was open to that as well. This idea that you could say that these are the kind of feminine qualities, intuitive qualities, which are overly rational culture just wants to kind of relegate to a secondary importance. And I'll just say one more thing. It's just that I love that concept. Is it attributed to Emma Goldstein? If I can't dance, it's not my revolution.
Emma Goldman.
Goldman, sorry. Yeah, if I can't dance, it's not my revolution. The whole essence of, you mentioned fun at the start, but also wildness in that are, you know, that the over-constricted nature of our society at the moment culturally is as much a contributor to mental health as anything.
Well, I think you're right. Yeah, I do think you're right about all that. I think the challenge is how to hold those insights together with recognizing the fact that all the historical evidence is that political progress, you know, requires discipline, patience, hard work, sacrifice, you know, and the ability to withstand decades of defeat and disappointment. And it's how you hold those things together, I think, is the challenge. I mean, that is the challenge before us over the next few decades, I think you're absolutely, I mean, from this point of view, I think there is something valuable in the idea of things like psychedelics or dancing or whatever as merely as therapeutic, to the extent that, well, for me, it's not a bad model of how you manage all those things, to say, like, look, like doing your politics is going to be quite boring and frustrating a lot of the time. You've got to go to meetings you don't want to go to. You know, your political work isn't going to feel like as joyful as going to a rave. And you need to also have things like, yeah, raves or your yoga or your meditation or your tripping as like part of your overall program, sort of, you know, self-care and mutual care, as a way of getting through all that, as a way of dealing with all that, rather than thinking the one can sort of substitute for the other. And for me, that's partly what it would mean to have a sort of healthy movement that could hold all those things together, which I think And I think, I mean, the trouble with Extinction Rebellion, you know, to be honest, is that's not what it is. The idea of Extinction Rebellion is you can sort of collapse the one into the other. You know, you just have and it's not Extinction Rebellion aren't the first people to do. It's the same with, you know, things like Reclaim the Streets in the 90s. It's the idea that the party just becomes the politics.
Yeah,
and then you stop actually doing any politics, and as soon as you come up against a strategic or institutional obstacle, you know, you're finished. It's over. Right? You don't have any solution. So I think you're right. On the one hand, you know, you want to avoid a sort of puritanical demand that all pleasure, you know, and indeed sort of mysticism and spirituality have to be deferred until like after the revolution. But I think you also have to avoid this sort of millenarian collapse of the one into the other and the substitute of the one for the other. And I think, I mean, it's easy to say, but it's very challenging. People do find it very difficult. People do find it very difficult to think, well, that indeed there's something. I think you're right. You know, there's that. I think the challenge, one of the challenges I think you're pointing to actually is indeed preserving that wildness, that weirdness, that intensity of those experiences, even without allowing them to become the thing that just defines you, the thing that defines everything you're doing. I mean, you know, I would say, thinking about the experience of our cohort, the kind of rave generation, I mean, what happened to a lot of people, to be honest, a lot of people I knew, is the crashing disappointment of the 1992 general election sent them off, sent them off into fields raving, to the point where for a few years they convinced themselves that was how the world was going to change. Yeah, they didn't. And when they woke up again, some point in the early 2000s, the Labour Party had been completely taken over by the Blairite right and was about to prosecute the Gulf War. Yeah, you know, the Iraq War. Yeah. And I think that is a very good example of what you don't want to do. Yeah, you don't want that to happen, because we've tried it, and that's where it landed us.
Well, definitely in that moment, that is what happened. And I'd say even in the mid 2000s with the anti-war movement, there was a period where there was a lot of intensity and a mixture of anarchists and socialists and peaceniks, you know, kind of CND, etc. And then somewhere along the line, that just got stretched out, and the gatherings became a little bit smaller and they were less disruptive, and then it kind of petered out. And I felt again the same thing with Occupy, although by then it didn't seem as revolutionary. My experience of Occupy St. Paul's is when I turned up, all of the usual suspects from the anarchist marches and the kind of anti-war marches weren't there, and there was a whole wave. There was still some old faces. But, you know, suddenly in the middle of St. Paul's, you had this kind of happening in a way, which was a mixture of the two. But again, it petered out. Again, it had lots of elements around it, which you didn't know were overly conspiratorial. It didn't have any real direction. So I absolutely agree that there has to be some kind of direction and organization. It's how it does peter out, and why. I think there are individual reasons. There are groups, individuals who, for one reason or another, either through too much drug taking or police infiltration, whatever, kind of check out. So, you know, the idea of self-care is one aspect of how that can be useful, you know, the kind of things like yoga and meditation. But this idea of it, I was listening to the podcast that Roger Hallam did from prison, and it was interesting because I wanted to, you know, get a proper handle on him. He seems to me just such overly eccentric that I felt that I didn't know how, you know, kind of serious and plausible his theories are. But there was one thing that he mentioned, you know, his podcast, Designing the Revolution. He talked about, for example, just organizing meetings, very basic things. So he calls it something like proximal or proximity of space. And I can't remember the exact term, but basically if enough familiar angles are there for someone to feel comfortable, they're more likely to come back to the next meeting. So very basic things like someone coming to an organizational meeting, you welcome in a stranger, you make them feel at home, you ask them questions, etc. Rather than, and this has been my experience, again, like I went to the first few Momentum meetings in Bristol when Jeremy Corbyn got voted in. And straight away, I got that same feeling that I had at certain anti-war meetings where the SWP kind of energy comes in and tells you exactly how it's going to be. And if you kind of deviate anywhere from it, you're kind of quickly shut down. And then you kind of think, well, I don't want to go back to that then really, because I don't feel part of it. And I think that that's what I mean, rather than say, you know, calling on some supernatural deity that's going to give us energy. It's more about how do we actually make each other feel good to be in each other's presence.
Well, I think that's a really good point. And I think it's, I would point out, I would stress that, you know, the one thing, I mean, one thing did come out of that Corbyn moment wherein people were really trying to think about those issues, and that's the world transformed and
Absolutely.
the transform movement.
Yeah.
And so, and Bristol transformed is a very different animal to Bristol momentum. And it was and it was because people involved with that were very directly interested in some of the questions we're talking about. And I think that was a really good model. There's a very hopeful model for me of how, yeah, because the people involved with organizing and the world transformed, and a lot of it's kind of local events, they're very directly concerned with these questions. Well, how do you bring something of the collective joy of the festival or experience or the dance hall experience to the experience of politics? And so it's not as if no one has really addressed those questions or dealt with it. I mean, the problem is really, I mean, indeed, and it's partly a problem you're pointing to. The problem really is that none of the institutions or individuals with any money at their disposal on the British left have ever recognised the importance of the world transformed or given them the resources that they deserved. You know, and that again, it has to be said. I think, I mean, I kept saying this to people, even during the high moment of Corbynism, sort of 2016, 2018 to 2018. I kept saying to people, look, in the States, somebody would have found like a couple of $1 million for the world transformed by this point.
Yeah.
You know, somebody would have done one of those like foundations, which, you know, have money, you know, mostly from kind of radicalized, you know, trust funders of the 60s, you know, somebody would have found a couple of $1 million for them, you know, to really allow them to scale up and go forward. And they got nothing like from the unions. I mean, they got a little bit, I mean, they got tiny bits of seed corn money from some of the unions. And that is a real difference, actually. It is a real difference. And it's partly, yeah, we've talked about some of the reasons for that difference between the States and here, but it's also just because, I mean, really, as a political force, you know, the counterculture in Britain, like, never came anywhere close, and the New Left, like, never came anywhere close to how it, you know, went in the States. I mean, it's, you know, I mean, you know this, but I mean, one of the things I'm often exercised by is the fact that there's this sort of official narrative, which you get both from sort of millennial leftists in the States and from people here, about the fate of the counterculture and the fate of the New Left in the States, which seems to think students for a democratic society and the sort of you know, psychedelic movement around the Bay Area, it all just sort of turned into the weathermen, you know, the weather underground, and then it just finished, which is just historically nonsense. I mean, actually, out of that historical moment, that's how they got, for example, the primary system, which for selecting candidates for the Democratic Party, and then it was taken up by the Republicans. So that's why you have this much more democratic process than we have here for selecting candidates. Yeah, that was an outcome of the 68. You know, things like SDS, the Students of a Democratic Society, you know, didn't, you know, a tiny sliver of it turned into the weather underground, but much more of it ended up turning into the Democratic Socialists of America, which is, you know, bigger now than it ever was. And in other way, I think, you know, the sort of affinities between the sort of strands of the counterculture and the psychedelic strands of the counterculture and sections of the political left in the States, you know, were much stronger, and the kind of institutional relationships have been much stronger over the years. So I don't want to sort of just say, oh, the grass is always greener, or kind of idealize the situation in America, but there's no equivalent to something like the Grateful Dead Foundation, sort of giving loads of money to progressive candidates, which is actually something that's happened in the States and happened for years. There's absolutely no equivalent here. I mean, the equivalent would have been, you know, Pink Floyd giving their money to actual kind of left causes in Britain, which, you know,
Well, unfortunately, Roger Water does that, but
they,
he gets so much hell
well,
for
he
it.
doesn't give money to left causes in Britain, though. He gives money
Right,
to
right,
Palestine,
yeah,
but he
yeah,
doesn't. He
yeah.
never put it. You know, people like no one. There was no equivalent who put their hand in their pocket for, you know, the World Transformed or for Momentum during those years. So
Do
I
you
think it is.
Yeah,
So
why?
I think that is I think that is a significant historical difference. That, and I think it is a legacy of the counterculture in the States. I mean, I was saying this. On the other hand, you know, I have had conversations with people in the States, or at least in parts of the States, who were very interested in the World Transformed, and their perception was that there was no equivalent there. That they felt that there just hadn't been any sort of I mean, they were. You know, I was talking to people who were particularly interested in the fact that there had been this quite positive relationship between the World Transformed and elements of post-rave sort of dance culture, and the people I was talking to about this a couple of years ago in the States, people who are, I think they're mostly active around LA, I think, were very frustrated by the fact that there just wasn't any equivalent of that in the States as they saw it. So I think nothing, yeah, the situation isn't perfect anywhere.
No.
But I think it's really important. It is really important to know that they did, yeah, the World Transformed is an example. I mean, for me, it's a perfect example of a political project, which has really tried to draw on all those lessons and tried to.
And it's still in existence.
But it still exists. I mean, it's struggling a
need-
bit. It's struggling to, you know, have a role, given that it was so tied to the project of Corbyn's leadership of Labour, and
Right.
given that for the most so much, it's not clear what the sort of political project is now of the post-Corbynite left. But yeah, it still exists. There are still local transformed organised festivals being planned. There's Devon Transformed is happening in September this year, which should be really nice.
Okay,
and
camping.
should be.
How is it camping? Is it
Yeah.
like a festival, little festival, mini festival?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll have to look out for that. And you did a podcast, which I think is great, by the way. I'm really enjoying it. I haven't listened to them all, but you know, there's a whole history there. Again, there is something about the States, always with all it has in its organizational and money-raising capacities. Culturally, they do look to Britain. I mean, you know, whether it's grime and drill, you know, whether it's rave culture, punk, there's always this thing that Britain, this island has created this music culture, which is, it's as original as it can be. I mean, I don't know what there's been in the last 10 years. You talk of the long 90s and musically that there's really not been much that's changed. But I would say that it fascinates me online watching, for example, reaction videos, and especially how American hip hop kind of aficionados are fascinated by British grime and they're just, you know, there's something culturally there that stands out. And, you know, so much so it's aware that you get conservative ministers kind of, you know, mocking the slang and you know, the cultural slang, which is becoming familiar now in London and in Britain, across Britain, because of music. I just feel that that's a way of almost leveling out working class culture beyond the identities, so-called identities imposed of left and right, that there is something in common, which is cultural, which is still almost anti-authoritarian in the worst parts of that authoritarianism. So I just wonder whether there's an avenue there through music culture as much as through psychedelic culture. You know, I think we're in a moment. That's my thing, and I feel very much why I'm going to just say my piece for half an hour at this conference next week. I'm sure that there's going to be quite a few people feeling the same way, but the overwhelming feeling is this almost flatten every little bit of culture that exists. Once
Well, I think I mean, the thing I would say about music, I mean, given that we're talking about psychedelics, is this is an absolute golden age of psychedelic music. The kind of ambient, new age, you know, quite obvious, and also sort of psychedelic jazz that's being put out by people like labels like International Anthem in the States and Gondwana in Manchester, for example.
Right.
It's an absolute golden age. Like if you like, and it's an absolute golden age. which is really interesting, and it's something that hasn't really been written about very much at all. And one of the things I'm interested in as a sort of cultural historian is what I sometimes call Afro psychedelia, the kind of Black contribution to psychedelic music culture, which you can trace back through figures like Miles Davis and Alice Coltrane very strongly. Well, that is now much more visibly present in areas of music culture, especially in the States, but also here to some extent than it ever has been before. So, and I think that is really interesting. I think that is really, I mean, to me, that's the single most hopeful thing about, I mean, as someone who writes about music and thinks about music a lot, there's this very self-consciously psychedelic music being made by mainly sort of Black artists, places like Chicago, London, Manchester, Detroit,
Oakland as well. Is there
yeah, I think so, yeah.
So I'm noticing that there's a big, the whole mushroom and kind of there's Darren the Baron, he goes as London guy of Caribbean descent, who's very much kind of a promoter of mushrooms and mushroom history and African history of mushrooms, and he's toured extensively across the States, and there seems to be a big, he's invited on loads of podcasts. And
it's true, but it's completely, I mean, it's a complete sort of transformation, really. I mean, we used to talk all the time, I mean, everybody used to talk about how white psychedelic culture was and psychedelic music, and there's the psytrance scene is historically
very white,
incredibly white and musically white, musically one of the whitest kinds of music anyone has ever thought of. And the fact that all that has changed, it's not an accident, and it's not an accident that's changed at the moment when Black Lives Matter has been happening, and there's been a sort of political radicalization of Black culture. And indeed, it's true, actually, friend, I mean, I think we all know, I mean, everybody knows anecdotally, sort of seeing Black friends getting really interested in psychedelics over the past few years when they thought it wasn't something for them sort of 20 years ago. It's really sort of fascinating.
Recognizing their history and the connection and how it's, again, connected to the land and connected to, kind of rhythms of the land and just being in community. And I don't know. I mean, I guess what we're waiting for or hoping for is I certainly something like a Red Wedge or Rock Against Racism. I guess that mixes music, culture. I guess it does happen anyway, but something that has some kind of cultural impact. Of course, there's going to be a pushback from it, but it just feels like if it's something that becomes fashionable, so to speak, then it builds up its own head of steam, rather than this, as I said, this way of now defining psychedelics culturally as something that can only happen in a laboratory under strict conditions. And it needs to be said with some. I feel that's the story, if anything, that a group like Symposia should be pushing forward more than anything. I'm sure they believe that on some level as well, because as I said, I find myself agreeing with them on a lot of matters, but that thing of trying to out, it's almost like the Keir Starmer version of Labour, of you try to outdo the Tories on law and order. You try to appear more sober and more rational than the people who are oppressing you, in somehow to gain some legitimacy. That's my fear, that's going to happen. And I maybe I shouldn't be fearing so much, because as I say, I can feel that there's a movement of people. It just needs to coalesce in some kind of organization. I guess that's where we need to be over the next few years, the next year or so, especially. So
I think you're right. I think you're right.
So have you got a few more of the podcasts? You still doing the podcasts? You got any coming up?
Yeah, well, I'm still doing, I mean, the two most regular, there's Love is the Message, which is a sort of music history podcast that comes out every week. And there's also ACFM on Novara Media, which is,
which is acid communism.
Well, it was acid communism, it was acid Corbynism, really.
Oh, yes.
When we started. I'm always a little bit circumspect about that phrase, acid communism.
How, in what sense? The word communism more than anything?
Well, yeah, partly the word Mark, it was partly because, I mean, Mark and I were really good friends, and it's a really nice term, but it was also sort of opportunistic. You know, he doesn't. It's not. He didn't have any interest in acid or any experience with it. So, I mean, that's not a. And also, yeah, communist. I mean, I'm funny about, you know, I'm funny about the term communism because I'm old enough to remember when, if you called yourself a communist, it meant you were a member of the Communist Party. And I still have friends who are members of the Communist Party of Britain. They're proper communists, these people. They go to Cuba, they go to China, you know, they see themselves as affiliated to the project of the Communist Party in China. And it's a bit, so I'm always a bit funny about this casual use of the term communist just to mean sort of anti-capitalist, which has became so popular about 15 years ago. That's partly just my age, you know, from when I was growing up in the 80s, you know, there were lots of people who were to the left of the Communist Party, but they would call themselves socialists. They call myself a socialist.
Yeah, but there's an impact with that word, isn't there? Still, it still gets people when you hear the word.
Well, it does, but that's partly why I call it opportunistic, because partly it's about getting a reaction more than it's about having a political project. That's what I think. That's my worry about it.
I guess in a media that's saturated with people seeking attention, anything they can get through. But that's, again, it's the falling foul of that thing of having to be kind of like the canary as a media organization, becoming very Daily Mail-esque in its headlines. So there is a worry about that. But so that's and what's that that podcast? That's not a music podcast. I've not really listened to that.
Well, ACFM, yeah. I mean, the whole project. I mean, the first episode we ever did was about the legacy of the idea of counterculture, and it's the whole project was about thinking through what it would mean to actually try to synthesize some of the things we were talking about today, sort of interest in, whether you're talking about interest in spirituality or intoxication or self-care or all these things, to integrate those with a sort of fairly mainstream leftist perspective on politics. So that's the project of the show, I think, is to always be.
Is it on once a week? Is it?
No, it's about once a month. It's on Novara Media.
Yeah. I've had my little run-ins with Aaron in the past, but you know, that's again as it is, because that's also a thing, is it, because it's so rare to have any kind of media organizations that actually do get to speak up, that, you know, once you're appearing on Sky News, etc., and once you've got the pressure of media, I kind of had a little bit of a, you know, in the way that it felt to me like that with the whole anti-Semitism crisis, there was a little bit of a distancing from Corbyn and some of the figures around him, which in a sense was probably inevitable, but it makes it really difficult, you know, for any group to really organize, because it seems that, you know, those who are in control understand the potential of that. They want to nip it in the bud as soon as they can. But yeah,
that's true.
You know, I hope we're having some kind of, if there's ever any sun, and we actually, because I do think that weather has a lot of an effect on whether there are mass gatherings over the next few months. But I hope for something positive next week. So you don't hold out much hope of this next wave of Extinction Rebellion? That's just a final thing, because I know we've spoken for quite a bit.
I mean,
that's happening next week as well, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I don't really. I'm afraid. I think it's. I mean, I don't see a political strategy there.
Yeah.
You know, the political strategy. A political strategy is about building a coalition and convincing and bringing more and more people around to the view that it's in their interest to support your project. So I think that might not be the purpose that Extinction Rebellion serves. I mean, it depends what you mean by hope and progress. I don't think Extinction Rebellion is going to contribute in any very meaningful way to advancing any of its stated goals. But I think a lot of the time, political projects of that nature, what they're really about is, during periods of relative, you know, political stasis, they at least give people a chance to come together and to experience a sense of solidarity, which is very important for just being able to carry on.
Yeah.
And I think I don't want to dismiss it for those reasons. You know, I always used to say to people about climate camp, you know, when people were critical of climate camp, that indeed, I don't think one person on planet Earth had their views on climate change, its causes or its solutions, changed by climate camp. But nonetheless, it played an important role for the people who took part in it, who, you know, might have just gone mad otherwise.
Yeah.
With frustration. So So I think XR, I'm sure it does play a role, and it plays that role. And insofar as, you know, the next time there is any political opportunity to actually influence government in a positive direction, you know, the extent to which, you know, it'll be a good thing for people still to have the issues XR wants us to think about in their minds is obviously quite significant. So I wouldn't dismiss it, but I think, you know, I think we already know that I don't even know what, to be honest, I haven't paid enough attention to know if what they are saying is going to happen. I mean, it was so the sort of the gap between what they claimed was going to happen the last time they had a big convergence and what actually happened was so sort of laughable, to be honest.
Yeah.
And the fact that they just didn't ever address the fact that they had said they were about to bring down parliamentary democracy and they clearly didn't. I think if you're going to go around saying you're going to do that and then you obviously don't, you at least have to sort of say publicly, well, actually, I don't think I'm being fair now, really, because I think they have issued statements in the past year about what they think didn't work, and you know they are presenting this as a different sort of project, the April events. So, I don't. So I don't know, really. I can't claim. I'm afraid I sort of stopped paying. I so much stopped paying attention to them a couple of years ago that I haven't really paid. I haven't really paid much attention to what it is they say they're going to achieve this time, and maybe they will achieve whatever they say they're going to achieve.
Okay, well, we shall see, I guess, next week. And yeah, it's all right. I could even cut that a little bit earlier.
All right.